When it comes to Gastro, I'm reminded of the saying, don't judge a book by its cover. Most of the time that comes to mind, it's because you've underestimated something in one way or another, but in the case of GF, I overestimated it. I saw a retro-styled FPS and assumed it'd be similar to other boomer shooters I've played with in the last few years. It definitely does fit into that subgenre of FPS games, but the truth is that there are way better boomer shooters out there. At the same time, the game wasn't entirely awful, and I'll start by bringing up its graphics and overall aesthetics. Depending on when your journey as a gamer started, this may be a good thing or a bad thing, but right from the start I was reminded of Castle Wolfenstein. I've always been more of a Doom fan, but having played and enjoyed CW, I didn't view that as a bad thing. Though I thought that was good, I was also bummed out by the pretty simple color palette featured early on. There was a whole lot of gray mixed in with the occasional different colors. I realized that art design in a game isn't everything, especially when games like Pong or Asteroids have stood the test of time for a reason, but for me, it gets bland to look at. That also spilled over into the enemies. There were different types of enemies, which I appreciated, but they still looked way too similar to one another. I thought this led to too much repetition. From what I experienced as I played through GF, I thought that the game would be short and sweet, so I assumed that I wouldn't end up thinking too badly of it. It was once I realized that the game would go beyond 10 levels that I started to think, oh boy. Besides the bland looking art design, the same could be said of the music. It's appropriate for the overall retro-styled nature of GF, but at the same time, it got old fast listening to the same track over and over again. Sometimes it's not a problem for me, but that's usually because it's a track I'm especially fond of, such as Aphex Twin's Helios Fan. I don't want to knock the composer, mainly because I eventually realized that there were more interesting tracks, but it was still way too repetitive for me. With how the music came off, I thought that part of GF had been overlooked. Like I said, there was more music than I initially thought there was, but it wasn't arranged well. It might have to do with the game engine's limitations, or maybe something else, but I would have liked for the music to have been better cycled. It's possible to have a single track play for the duration of a level, but that's easier said than done. As usual, I was happy to see that right from the start I could determine which control scheme I wanted to use. Rather than having to go to the options and change things up, it was easy for me to figure it out while in-game. At the same time, hitting small enemies and aiming down felt like more work than it should have been. I thought that aiming could have been tighter. It felt too loose for my liking. I realized that I could change the sensitivity settings, but it was still rough to control. As if having a hard time being able to properly shoot at enemies wasn't bad enough, it was the same thing with door activators. Sometimes I'd literally be standing in front of one, be shooting right at the center, and yet the door activator wouldn't respond. That was especially annoying to deal with later on in the game because ammo was scarce. The taser helped conserve some of my ammunition, but I still had the same problem with it as I did with some of the other guns. Not wanting to get stuck due to parts of GF feeling off to me, I looked for solutions. I knew that the shooting wasn't as well adjusted as I would have liked, mainly when aiming vertically, so I eventually realized that horizontal-based shooting worked best. I wish I could say that was an automatic solution to my shooting issues, but that'd be a lie. Movement in general was hard to handle. Wide and spacious levels made it easier to get around, but every level wasn't like that. Sometimes I'd be in a tight space with numerous enemies, so smooth maneuverability was hard to pull off. That made me realize that I had to dodge more often than in other boomer shooters. Being able to freely dash without having to worry about a stamina bar was nice, but I would have preferred better movement control from the start. The weapons available to use in GF were pretty basic. Some were better than others, such as the machine gun and the pistol, mainly because of their fire rate, but also thanks to the pistol more or less immobilizing enemies. It was great to be able to take advantage of that because I could corral enemies into a tight space and take them down at my pace without worrying about taking damage or being overwhelmed. Later on, I encountered weapon upgrades and I was happy to see that. They definitely did count as upgrades, mainly because they made the weapons hit harder, faster, and there were cosmetic changes. What bothered me about the weapon upgrades is that it would have been better had they been more spread out all over the game. With how things were, it came off as if they were too bunched up towards the end of the game. Having them more spread out would have made GF better balanced, and I'm sure that I wouldn't have had such a difficult time during specific moments. One of the most enjoyable parts of GF was its level design. I liked how it initially managed to balance having maze-like areas while also including open spaces. I also liked how the level design was pretty intuitive. It wasn't like that throughout the entire game, but for the most part, I'd say it was easy to get around. It also helped that GF featured a map that filled up as you went through the level. Rather than using it to orient myself, I used it to make sure that I'd covered as much of the map as I could. This helped not only to find secret areas, which there were plenty of, but also to make sure that I'd taken care of every enemy. One of the problems with boomer shooters is that they lean too much on what the genre is known for. It's not entirely bad, but I prefer it when there's a strong foundation and yet enough deviation so that a game can stand on its own. Instead, too many will either come off as a one-to-one ripoff or it'll seem like a bad imitation. Different strokes for different folks comes to mind, but I like what I like. That's why I thought that having to look for power generators for force fields was slightly better than scouring levels for keys. Searching for keys ended up being used later on in the game, so I wasn't surprised. I still stand by having said that the level design of GF was one of the better parts, but much like with some of the enemies, they eventually started to get old. Thankfully, the level started to change up and force you to do different things. Unfortunately, what's new eventually became old because of constantly looking at the same color schemes and enemies over and over again. That led me to believe that rather than having 30 levels, it could have delivered a tighter and more enjoyable experience with 20 or even 15 levels. That would have made GF feel like less of a chore to go through. The combination of the number of levels and a huge difficulty jump towards the end of GF led to me feeling frustrated. I don't mind hard games as long as their difficulty feels fair. In GF, the difficulty felt artificially hard. The levels got super long, they featured a lot of enemies, and resources became very scarce. By this point in the game, the enemy blandness was no more, thanks to different designs and colors, but they still came off as more challenging. In one level, it was nearly 90 enemies that I had to kill. Knowing when to switch between weapons helped a lot with this. Rather than sticking to my preferred weapon, I was forced to use everything at my disposal or figure out what best suited the situation I happened to be in. At times I resorted to cheesy tactics, such as luring out enemies one by one while standing behind cover. That affected my completion time for the level, but I cared more about advancing through the game. What bothered me about this is that it felt like a cheap way of making GF hard. Tossing a lot of enemies into a tight space in a game where your maneuverability is questionable is a fast way to lead to frustration. I eventually overcame this, but at times, I felt like a drunk on a packed train trying to get off. Even with moving around and the dodge ability, I'd end up crashing into either the walls or enemies. It also didn't help that some rooms in the levels had environmental hazards. I could be trying to dodge multiple enemies at once only to end up dying due to going over acid, or a collapsible grate would cause me to fall and instantly die. The necessary ingredients for a better game are here, but with how they were utilized, the result was a game that at times was frustrating to deal with. I was especially frustrated towards the end of the game. I'm sure some might be thinking, LOL, get good, but there's more to it than that. Section 3, Area 28 took me hours to beat. It's because of how long it was and how many enemies there were, but the number of traps also didn't help. I could understand this level being this way if I saw that it leaned more towards being fair, but it wasn't entirely like that. Something that really bugged me about this level and some of the others in this section is that it featured trap ceilings. I quickly realized that being directly under it as it came down would lead to an instant death. That sounds fair, but I eventually saw that even touching the trap ceiling while not being directly under it would lead to an instant death. That was absolutely infuriating for me to deal with. I realize that's a nitpick and it might not seem like a big deal, but there were plenty of small issues such as this one that eventually became a noticeable pile. It's strange to notice, but some of the levels came off as harder than their area's boss. It's mainly because the levels were long gauntlets with scarce supplies, but also because it was easy to go from dying to fighting the boss again fairly quickly. I thought it was weird that the final boss was much easier than the levels that led up to it. I'm sure that I'd be complaining if the boss were even harder than the final levels, but at the same time, the levels and the boss could have been better balanced. Makes me want to go back to my idea that GF would have been better had it been a shorter and tighter experience, but all I can do is judge the game for what it is rather than for what I'd like for it to be. Gastro Force is a game that didn't meet my expectations. I expected good things from it and there definitely were enjoyable parts, but in general, it was a chore to get through. I realize this isn't much of a compliment, but Gastro Force isn't absolutely terrible. While that may be true, you won't miss out by not playing it. It's not only because at times it felt like I was playing against it rather than with it, but also because there are better boomer shooters out there. The blandness of the art design, the imbalanced difficulty mixed in with imprecise controls, and the length of Gastro Force leave me not wanting to recommend it. Does a game need to have good art design in order for you to enjoy it? How do you feel about a game that's difficult to control? Are there any games that suffered as a result of being too long for their own good? If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, share, and if you're up for it, become a patron. Thank you very much for watching.